Ficciones is a collection of short stories by Jorge Luis Borges. Let's summarize them now. In the prologue to part 1 of Ficciones, Borges introduces the first 8 stories of Ficciones, previously published in 1941 as the collection The Garden of Forking Paths, and gives hints on how to read some of them. In Talon, Ukbar, Orbis Tertius, the narrator and his friend discover a fake planet's history invented by a secret society, which has far-reaching consequences for the planet Earth. In The Approach to Al-Mutasim, the narrator comments on commentary about a novel in which a man searches for another man by looking for traces of him in other people. In Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote, a 20th century Frenchman attempts to write Don Quixote as the exact text Cervantes wrote without copying it. In The Circular Ruins, a man creates another man by dreaming him, realizing he too is someone else's dream. In The Babylon Lottery, the narrator explains the evolution of the lottery, which soon subjects all of Babylonian life to chance. An examination of the work of Herbert Quain is about the works of a fictitious deceased Irish writer named Herbert Quain, who wrote strange and inventive works. In The Library of Babel, the first-person narrator describes an immense, perhaps infinite, library of unreadable books. In The Garden of Forking Paths, German spy Dr. Yu Soon meets the man who has solved the puzzle of his grandfather's labyrinth. In the prologue of part 2, Artifices, Borges comments on a couple of stories, and he says he added 3 additional stories after the original publication of Ficciones. In Funes the Memorious, the narrator recalls a childhood friend, Ariano Funes, who had a remarkable mind and memory. In The Form of the Sword, the narrator recounts a meeting with an Irishman. When he asks the man how he got the scar on his face, the man tells the story of his betrayal by a cowardly man named John Vincent Moon himself. In Theme of the Traitor and the Hero, the narrator proposes a basic future story in which a descendant, Ryan, discovers Fergus Kilpatrick was a traitor who arranged to have himself assassinated in a dramatic way that would inspire future generations. In Death and the Compass, Detective Eric Lonrut chases an infamous criminal, Red Sharlock, who sets a psychological trap. In The Secret Miracle, writer Jaromir Hladik is arrested by the Nazis and sentenced to death, and he prays to God for 1 year of life so he can finish writing his tragedy, The Enemies. Time stops, and he completes the work in his mind. In 3 Versions of Judas, a Swedish theologian proposes Judas was the true incarnation of God. In The End, a paralyzed barman witnesses a fight between characters from the 19th century Argentinian epic poem, The Gaucho Martin Fierro. In The Sect of the Phoenix, an underground society thrives for centuries, united by its practice of the secret, which the narrator never explains. In The South, an Argentinian receives a copy of The 1001 Nights, hits his head reading it, and is hospitalized. He's later challenged to a knife fight in which he thinks he will surely die. There are 7 key characters in the short story collection Ficciones. Dr. Stephen Albert had been a missionary in China. He later decided to become a sinologist. Dr. Yu Soon thinks there is something of the priest and something of the sailor about him. He's the only man who understands the secret of the labyrinth created by Shui Pen, Dr. Yu Soon's grandfather. Ireneo Funes is afflicted with acute perception and tremendous memory, and prefers to lie in the dark back room of his mother's shack. His great memory enables him to learn languages quickly and even develop a quixotic number system, but he cannot form general ideas. He's brilliant, but incommunicable and ultimately powerless. Jaromir Hladik is a writer and translator who lives in Prague and is arrested during the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia at the start of World War II. He's accused of being Jewish, which he is, and of Judaizing, as the Nazis say, the works of a German. He passes the time in prison in an agony of anticipation and is able to finish his work in his mind when a prayer causes time to freeze. Eric Lonrut is a detective, a gentleman of leisure who takes on criminal cases for his own intellectual interest. He rejects simple explanations in favor of interesting ones, but Lonrut is wrong about everything in Death and the Compass. When confronted with his errors, he submits to his death at the hands of the arch-criminal Red Sharlock, and proposes they will have this fatal encounter again and again as time repeats itself. Pierre Menard's ambition to write Don Quixote is simultaneously small and large. To perfectly recreate the 17th century novel is a huge ambition. But if Menard succeeds, he should disappear as an author, since his work will be exactly the same as the novel by Cervantes. He only completes 2 chapters. John Vincent Moon explains he's Irish, but otherwise carries on with the pretense he's not John Vincent Moon. He relates his infamies, his arrogance, and his self-dealing in pitiless detail. Moon portrays himself as perfectly blameworthy, lazy, and like an invertebrate. He invites the narrator to despise me. He still hasn't gotten over his acts of cowardice. Commissioner Trevoranus is the police commissioner in A Buenos Aires of Dreams, the bumbling, narrow-minded second to Lanrut's brilliant Sherlock Holmes-style detective in Death and the Compass. Where Lanrut sees a complicated plot entangled with Jewish mysticism, Trevoranus sees a simple case of robbery gone wrong. He's right. Mirrors and labyrinths are the reality-bending symbols in the short story collection Ficciones. Mirrors symbolize duplication. For example, in the story Death and the Compass, Lanrut arrives at the villain's lair and finds himself infinitely reflected in opposing mirrors. These reflections are fitting because Sherlock is a reflection of Lanrut. Like Lanrut, he reads Hebraic books and interprets crimes on that basis. In the story The Approach to Al-Mutassim, the illustrated book The Approach to Al-Mutassim is subtitled A Game with Shifting Mirrors. In that story, the law student meets a succession of men, each of them a mirror of Al-Mutassim. But the mirror shifts because in the end, there is the suggestion the law student himself is Al-Mutassim. The mirrors stand for the way art and thought create duplicate worlds or duplicate selves. Thus, in the entryway to the infinite and surreal library in Babel, there hangs a mirror which faithfully duplicates appearances. The mirror's duplication reveals that both the real world and its reflection are nothing but appearances. Thus, the mirror removes some reality from the so-called real world. This is one way in which mirrors have something grotesque about them, as the narrator states in Talon, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius. In that story, the narrator and his friend discover from the far end of the corridor the mirror was watching us. The world in the mirror, or the mirror itself, can acquire a grotesque autonomy in Ficciones. Labyrinths represent the wanderer's perplexity and the maze maker's attempt to construct something infinite. They also represent the tangled paths of thought and interpretation. Although labyrinths are an important symbol in Ficciones, they are mentioned rather than depicted. Labyrinths turn up in book titles, A General History of Labyrinths in Talon, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius, and The God of the Labyrinth in that same story, and also in an examination of the works of Herbert Quain. Perhaps most significant of all is the difference between a physical and a written labyrinth that marks the central focus of The Garden of Forking Paths. Yu Sun's grandfather, Choi Pen, retires to write a novel and create a labyrinth. At his death, he bequeaths his heirs the novel The Garden of Forking Paths, but no one can find his labyrinth. Like all the labyrinths in Ficciones, Choi Pen's is a symbolic labyrinth, as Stephen Albert points out. Its maze-like forking paths represent the multiplicity of possible interpretations. Copies, interpretation, and infinity are the heady themes in the Jorge Luis Borges short story collection, Ficciones. Ficciones contains any number of doubles and reflections, imitation worlds, and imitated books. Often these copies have a complicated and troubling relationship to the originals. Sometimes they overwhelm, undermine, or infiltrate the original. In Talon, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius, a secret society of philosophers invents Talon, disseminating information about it through a plagiarized encyclopedia. In Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote, a 20th century French writer sets out to write Don Quixote, not to copy the 16th century Spanish Cervantes novel, but to produce it anew, word for word, to become the author who could, and did, write Don Quixote, only at the present time. In 3 versions of Judas, a Swedish theologian proposes Judas as a kind of reflection of Jesus, or even the true incarnation of God. Again, the copy or double is superior to the original. Judas is Jesus with the addition of infamy and sin. With sly humor, Jorge Luis Borges proposes an image of the world superior to the actual world. Interpretation is a critical part of Ficciones, in which detectives, spies, and scholars examine texts for multiple meanings. Many are tongue-in-cheek, poking fun at critics and scholars. Several other stories in Ficciones are also commentaries on imaginary works. A great example of interpretation's added significance is Death in the Compass. The cerebral detective Labyrinths is convinced the motive for the murders lies in the scholarly texts in the first murdered man's hotel room. Dismissing the straightforward interpretation, robbery and mistaken identity, Labyrinths' powers of interpretation are equaled by the villains, who ultimately out-interprets the detective. Sometimes Borges seems like his double, Herbert Quain, whose books try hard to astonish. Quain writes complicated experimental works, which the narrator prefers the more complicated interpretations of. Many of the stories in Ficciones concern infinity as artworks or systems, meaning they have no limits or boundaries and are thus endless. The Babylon Lottery evolves from a simple cash prize to a system in which the number of lottery drawings is infinite. Herbert Quain thinks demiurges and gods would choose an infinite scheme, infinite stories, infinitely subdivided. In The Garden of Forking Paths, Stephen Albert refers to the moment at which the 1001 Nights becomes metafictional. Scheherazade starts to tell the story of herself telling the 1001 Nights, and within that telling, she risks again arriving at the night upon which she will relate it, and on to infinity. In Ficciones, Borges often presents infinity alongside an idea of circularity.